I once ordered an artillery strike to level an insurgent stronghold in Kandahar. But the most ruthless shot I ever took came from my own father's mouth, right in the middle of our living room. He didn't use lead. He used our own blood to bury a bullet in my skull. Georgetown at Christmas looked like a postcard, but it smelled like a trap. Stepping into the Pina townhouse was like walking into a meat grinder draped in silk. The air was thick, cloying with the scent of Tom Ford tobacco vanille and expensive gin. It felt heavy, pressing against my lungs. I didn't take off my coat. The navy blue wool was frayed at the cuffs, a relic of a life spent in damp barracks and humid decks. I kept it buttoned tight. Underneath, my service dress blues felt like a second skin, but in this room, they were a target. My right hand moved instinctively to my pocket, brushing against a folded piece of paper, the KIA certificate for Miller. He was gone, and I was here, standing in a room full of people who wouldn't know a foxhole from a golf course. Scanning the room was muscle memory. 3 exits. One behind the bar, the main double doors, and the French windows leading to the balcony. 15 soft-bellied men in 3-piece suits. Lobbyists, politicians, leeches. They held their champagne flutes like scepters, laughing at jokes that cost taxpayers millions. My sister, Emily, was near the fireplace. She caught my eye for a split second, her hand fluttering to her diamond necklace. A bauble probably bought with the interest from one of our father's consulting fees. She looked away fast, turning back to a senator's wife with a rehearsed smile. To her, I wasn't a sister. I was a ghost at a feast. Then, I heard him. Frank Pina's voice cut through the room like a hacksaw through bone. He didn't walk over, he marched. Frank moved with the unearned confidence of a man who had spent 40 years selling other people's souls in D.C. Before I could shift my weight, his hand came down, hard. He slapped my left shoulder, the exact spot where 3 shrapnel scars lived. A white-hot line of pain shot down my arm, vibrating against the bone. My vision blurred for a microsecond, but I didn't flinch. I stood like a pillar of salt. Frank didn't let go. He kept his hand there, squeezing the bruised tissue, and turned to the crowd with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Everyone, look what the wind blew in," Frank barked. His voice was booming, designed to dominate the room. My youngest, not exactly the one I brag about. A bit of a stain on the family upholstery, but she never misses a chance for a free meal. A ripple of laughter went through the room. It was a polite, cruel sound. I felt the sweat on Frank's palm through the wool of my coat. He was radiating heat, the smell of bourbon and desperation coming off him in waves. Threat assessment. Target is agitated. Elevated heart rate. Sweat on the upper lip. He wasn't just being a jerk. He was scared. He knew I had the records. He knew I'd seen the discrepancies in the pension fund he was supposed to be managing for me. I lowered my own heart rate, 60 beats per minute, steady. I watched the pulse point in his neck, counting the throb of his carotid artery. I stepped back half an inch, sinking my weight into my rear leg, establishing a 3-foot tactical perimeter. "I'm not here for the food, Frank," I said. My voice was flat, devoid of the tremor he wanted. Frank's face flushed a deep, ugly purple. He opened his mouth to bark another insult, but the sound of the front door closing stopped him. The room went quiet. It wasn't the kind of quiet that follows a lull in conversation. It was the silence that happens when a predator walks into a room full of prey. Daniel Carter moved through the tuxedoed crowd like a shark through a school of minnows. He wasn't wearing a suit. He was in his dress whites, the metals on his chest clicking softly with every stride. The polished leather of his boots hit the oak floor with a sharp, dry crack, the sound of real authority. He stopped 6 feet away. He ignored Frank entirely. Daniel looked at me, his eyes scanning my posture, noting my defensive tilt. His expression went from neutral to stone in a heartbeat. He didn't offer a hand. He knew better. Instead, he snapped his heels together. The sound echoed off the high ceilings like a gunshot. His hand shot up to his brow in a perfect, rigid salute. "Ma'am," Daniel's voice carried to every corner of the room, cold and absolute. "Admiral." The freeze was total. A senator near the bar fumbled his drink. The crystal glass slipped from his fingers, hitting the Persian rug with a dull thud, the champagne soaking into the expensive wool. No one moved to pick it up. Frank's hand dropped from my shoulder like it had been burned. He looked at Daniel, then back at me, his mouth hanging open. The moocher, he'd just introduced to his friends, had just been saluted by a Navy SEAL. I didn't give him the satisfaction of a look. I turned on my heel, the friction of my boots audible in the dead air. I didn't say goodbye. I walked toward the French windows, the cold draft from the glass already calling to me. Behind me, the silence was a vacuum. I pushed the handle down and stepped out onto the balcony. The December air hit my face like a slap. It was honest, it was sharp, it was exactly what I needed. As I leaned against the stone railing, looking out at the dark silhouette of the Potomac, the cold felt familiar. It felt like the many years of winter I'd spent in this house before I was old enough to run. The heat of the party was behind me, the frost was ahead. And for the first time in a long time, the battlefield was exactly where I wanted it to be. The December air didn't just hit my face, it bit. It was a jagged, honest cold that tasted like the Potomac in winter, sharp, metallic, and unforgiving. I leaned against the stone railing of the balcony, my lungs burning as they pulled in the frost. Behind the glass doors, the muffled hum of the Georgetown elite sounded like a swarm of cicadas. Heavy footsteps thudded behind me. I didn't have to turn around. I knew the cadence. Arrogant, heavy-heeled. "You embarrassed me in front of the secretary," Frank hissed. The smell of bourbon reached me before he did. He grabbed my elbow, his fingers digging into the wool of my coat like talons. I didn't wince. I didn't move. I just looked down at his hand, then up at his face. His eyes were bloodshot, his skin the color of raw steak. "Let go, Frank," I said. "You think that little stunt with Carter makes you untouchable? You're a guest here, a charity case." He squeezed harder. I felt the pressure against the bone. Tactical assessment, close quarters intrusion. Target is overextending. I didn't argue. I didn't shout. I simply twisted my arm, a sharp mechanical rotation that broke his grip before he could blink. I stepped into his space, pinning him with a stare that had made seasoned captains sweat on a bridge. "No," I said. One word, sharp as a shard of glass. I watched his throat move as he swallowed. He wanted to hit me. He wanted to scream. But he was a coward who lived for optics, and there were 300 people on the other side of that glass. I turned my back on him and walked inside. The transition from the frost to the house was jarring. The heat was stifling, thick with the smell of roasting lamb and ego. I headed for the grand staircase, 40 frames. I counted them as I walked the long hallway of the second floor. 40 moments of Pina history nailed to the mahogany. Pictures of Frank at the White House. Pictures of the family dog. Pictures of Emily's debutante ball. I looked for a single trace of myself. Nothing. Not a graduation photo. Not a snapshot from my deployment. I was a ghost haunting a museum dedicated to someone else's life. Emily was at the top of the stairs. She was fiddling with her diamond necklace, her eyes darting toward the noise below. She looked like a trapped bird in a very expensive cage. "Just let it be, Lily," she whispered, her voice thin and shaking. "Don't do this tonight. Don't ruin it. He's already on edge about the contracts." I didn't stop. I didn't even slow down. I brushed past her, the silk of her dress rustling against my coat. "You chose your side, Emily," I said under my breath. "I hope the jewelry stays warm at night." I reached the door at the end of the hall. My door. Or it used to be. I turned the handle. It didn't stick. It didn't resist. It just opened into a void. The room was gone. The twin bed where I'd dreamed of the sea, gone. The desk where I'd studied for the academy until my eyes bled, gone. The shelves were ripped out. The walls were a sterile corporate beige. In their place stood humidors, row after row of dark wood boxes filled with Frank's expensive cigars, a climate-controlled tomb for his hobbies. I walked to the corner where my bookshelf used to be, my track medals, My acceptance letter to West Point, the one Frank had sneered at before I chose the Navy just to spite him. I knew where they were. He hadn't put them in a box. He had put them in the trash years ago. I could almost feel the phantom weight of the paper in my hand. I reached out and touched a single, jagged nail protruding from the wall. It was the only thing left, the nail that had held my commission photo. My finger came away with a smudge of rust. This wasn't just a renovation, it was a deletion. He hadn't just kicked me out, he had erased the fact that I had ever existed under this roof. He wanted me to be a stranger, so it would be easier to rob me. I'm standing here in the dark, touching a rusted nail in a room that used to be mine, and I'm wondering, have you ever been erased? Have you ever looked at the people who raised you and realized they don't see a person, they see an obstacle? If you felt that cold, that absolute silence of being a ghost in your own life, do me a favor. Hit that like button, subscribe to this channel so we can walk through this fire together. And leave a comment below. Just write, I am here. Let me know I'm not the only one Frank Pini tried to disappear. The light from the hallway vanished. A shadow fell across the floor, long and distorted. I didn't turn. I heard the heavy click of a leather heel. Then the sound of the oak door swinging shut. Click. The bolt slid home. The sound echoed in the empty room like a hammer on a coffin lid. I turned slowly. Frank was leaning against the door, his tie loosened, his eyes dark with a predatory hunger. He wasn't the boisterous host anymore. He was the man who had stolen my mother's peace and my father's legacy. You shouldn't have come up here, Lily, he said, his voice a low growl. The space felt smaller. The air turned stale. In the back of my mind, the tactical siren started to wail. One exit, locked, one target, hostile. I stood in the center of my erased past and felt my heart rate settle into a steady, lethal rhythm. You're right, Frank, I said, my voice echoing in the hollow room. I shouldn't have come back for memories. I should have come back for blood. Frank Pina didn't pace like a man who was in charge. He paced like a trapped animal in a custom-tailored suit. His heels clicked on the oak floor, a sharp, uneven rhythm that betrayed the bourbon-soaked panic humming under his skin. The air in the room was stale, thick with the smell of cheap cigars and the lingering scent of his desperation. I didn't move. I leaned against the cold glass of the window, arms crossed. Tactical assessment. Target is overheating. Respirations are shallow. He was sweating through his silk shirt, the dark stains blooming under his armpits like rot. Who the hell do you think you are, Lily? Frank rumbled, his voice low and jagged. He stopped and jabbed a finger toward my face. What kind of game are you playing with my future son-in-law? You're a moocher, a stain. You are definitely not an admiral. I watched the carotid artery in his neck throb. It was a frantic beat. He was terrified that the lie he'd built, the image of the deadbeat daughter, was crumbling in front of his DC donors. I always tell the truth, Frank, I said. My voice was a flat line. You're only afraid because you can't control it. He let out a sharp, ugly laugh. He stepped into my perimeter, the heat from his body hitting me like a physical weight. He smelled like tobacco and ego. Control it? I'll bury it, he hissed. I'm going to make a few calls to the Pentagon. I know people in the Joint Chiefs who owe me favors. I'll have that military ID of yours stripped before the sun comes up. You'll be nothing but a civilian with a psychiatric record. He waited for me to break. He wanted the tears, the begging, the collapse he'd seen 1,000 times from the people he'd crushed. I let a cold smirk tug at the corner of my mouth, a slight, upward tilt of my lip. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my keys. I didn't say a word. I just thumbed the heavy brass ring, letting them chime softly in the silence. It was a small sound, but in that empty room, it sounded like a hammer hitting an anvil. Then call them, I said. Stop trying to control things that are light years beyond your reach, Frank. You're out of your league. His face went from raw steak red to a sickly mottled purple. He didn't have a comeback. He just turned, his boots scuffing the wood, and fumbled with the lock. He yanked the door open and stormed out, leaving the scent of his fear behind. I stayed by the window. 10 minutes passed. The house was quiet. The party downstairs, a muffled, distant drone. Then the door opened again. It wasn't Frank. Daniel Carter walked in. He'd shed the formal stiffness of the party. He didn't bring a drink. He brought a heavy black leather file and a small silver USB drive. He stopped exactly 1 meter away, maintaining the gap of professional respect. Kandahar, August 2018, Daniel said. His voice was gravel and iron. The signal went dark. We were pinned down in a dry creek bed with 300 pounds of ordnance raining on our heads. You were the one who held the artillery coordinates for 48 hours in the mud so we could get the birds in. I looked at him. I could still taste the copper of the blood and the grit of the sand in my teeth when I thought about that hole. I didn't say anything. I didn't have to. He doesn't have a clue, does he? Daniel asked, nodding toward the door where Frank had vanished. I shook my head. Frank only sees what can be traded or sold. He doesn't understand blood. Daniel walked over to the desk and dropped the file. The thud it made was final. It was the sound of a closing door. Inside is the verified, classified record of your command, Daniel said, his eyes hard. And tomorrow is the official engagement party. Frank's planning to use his keynote speech to publicly denounce you. He's going to paint you as a fraud to the press to cover the fact that he's been skimming your service pension for his own campaign funds. I picked up the USB. The metal was cold against my palm, a stark contrast to the thumb callus I'd earned from years of pulling triggers and holding lines. I gripped it tight. We're not going to stop him, I said. My voice had dropped, turning into the low, lethal hum of a tactical briefing. Daniel tilted his head. Ma'am. I looked at the invitation on the desk. Thick cardstock with gold leafing, an expensive lie. Let him speak, I said. Let him stand on that stage in front of every camera in D.C. and tie his own noose. Let him get it nice and tight. I looked Daniel in the eye. The cold from the window was in my bones now, but it felt good. It felt like the steel of a ship. I'm not going to stop him from tying himself to that pole, I said. I'm just going to be the one to provide the fire. I turned back to the window. Outside, the lights of Georgetown were a blur. Tomorrow the uniform would be crisp. The medals would be polished. And Frank Pina was going to find out exactly what happens when you try to gaslight a woman who's walked through hell just to get home. The silence in the room wasn't empty anymore. It was armed. 5:30. The Georgetown townhouse stank of yesterday's sins. The heavy, cloying scent of spilled Cabernet and stale cigar smoke hung in the air like a humid blanket. Downstairs, I could hear the rhythmic, wet snoring of some lobbyist who had passed out on the velvet sofa. It was the sound of soft men living off hard lies. I didn't care about their hangovers. I sat on the edge of my narrow bed in the guest room, the room that used to be a closet before Frank needed to look like a family man for the cameras. I reached down and grabbed my running boots. The leather was scarred, the soles worn thin from miles of tarmac and desert sand. I pulled the laces, tight. One sharp tug. The friction burned my calloused palms, but the pressure felt right. It felt like reality. In this house, everything was designed to be soft. The carpets, the voices, the morals. My boots were the only honest things within 5 city blocks. I stood up, my spine cracking into a perfect rigid line. I didn't need a mirror to know my posture was a threat. To people like Frank, a woman who stands straight is a woman who won't bend for their convenience. I walked down to the kitchen. The marble floor was cold enough to bite through my socks. I moved quietly like a shadow, ignoring the empty bottles of Bollinger littering the hallway. I reached the stove and started the coffee. No pods, no fancy machines. Just a battered French press and grounds as black as coal. I watched the water slowly boil, the steam clouding the window that looked out over the Potomac. The river looked like a sheet of lead under the gray December sky. I poured the coffee. No cream, no sugar. Just the bitter, oily heat of the bean. I took a long sip and let the burn settle in my throat. It was the only thing in this zip code that didn't have a coating of artificial sweetener. 7 o'clock. The silence broke. The heavy thud of leather loafers on the stairs told me the predator was awake. Frank Pina didn't walk into a room. He invaded it. He was wearing a $1,000 silk robe, but his face was mottled, the broken capillaries in his cheeks glowing a dull, angry red. He wasn't carrying a cup of coffee. He was carrying a weapon in his hands. He slammed the iPad onto the marble countertop. The device skidded across the stone, stopping inches from my hand. "Read it," Frank growled. His voice was a jagged saw cutting through the morning quiet. "Read what the world thinks of you, Lily." I didn't reach for the device immediately. I took another slow, measured sip of my black coffee. I felt his anger vibrating off the walls, a desperate, needy heat. I counted to 5. Then I leaned over and looked at the screen. It was an anonymous hit piece on a DC internal news site, the kind of trashy digital rag where politicians buried their bodies. The headline was in bold black letters. "The instability of a female officer when training creates delusions." The article was a masterpiece of character assassination. It used all the buzzwords Frank's people loved. It called me unstable. It whispered about psychological fractures from combat. It suggested that my rank was a fabrication of a mind broken by PTSD. It painted me as a hoarder of false glory, a woman using a uniform to cover a crumbling psyche. I stared at the words. My jaw didn't move, my pulse didn't jump. But inside, I felt the old, cold fire start to lick at my ribs. I remembered Corporal Miller. He was 23 when he came home. He had the same look in his eyes I had, the 1,000-yard stare that made civilians uncomfortable. The local papers ran a story about him, calling him a danger to the community after a minor bar fight. They used his service against him. They turned his sacrifice into a reason to fear him. Miller didn't have an Admiral's stars. He just had a shotgun and a garage. He didn't survive the weekend. Frank was using that same ink. He was using the blood Miller spilled to print his lies. He was using the very real pain of every soldier who ever woke up screaming to protect his campaign fund. He was weaponizing the sacrifice of men and women he wasn't fit to salute. Frank was standing there, arms crossed over his chest, his eyes locked on mine. He was waiting. He wanted a reaction. He wanted me to scream, to throw the iPad, to beg him to use his connections to make it go away. He wanted me to be the broken girl he'd been telling everyone I was. I swiped my thumb across the screen. I read the last paragraph. It was filled with flowery, overblown prose, words like tapestry and vibrant and melancholy. It was the kind of writing that tried too hard to be literature. I pushed the iPad away. It slid across the marble with a dry, scratching sound. I picked up my coffee cup and took a long drag. The bitterness was perfect. "The prose is a little heavy-handed," I said. My voice was a flat, dead calm. "Your press assistant really needs to work on his vocabulary. He's using too many adjectives. It makes the lie look desperate." Frank's face went from mottled red to a deep, bruising purple. The veins in his neck popped, thick and distorted. My silence had pierced him deeper than any insult. It was a vacuum he couldn't fill with his noise. "Is that all you have to say?" he roared. "You're being called a fraud, a lunatic. Your career is a funeral pyre and you're critiquing the grammar?" He lashed out. It was a fast, clumsy motion. He swiped the porcelain cup right out of my hand. The cup hit the floor and exploded. A sharp, loud crack echoed through the kitchen. Shards of white porcelain skittered across the tile like tiny teeth. The black coffee splashed against the white baseboards and soaked into the expensive Persian rug, a dark, ugly stain spreading like a shadow. I didn't flinch. I didn't even look down at the mess. I kept my eyes locked on his. Frank was panting, his chest heaving under the silk. He looked small. "You're making a mess of the rug, Frank," I said. I turned my back on him and walked toward the door. I could feel the USB drive Daniel gave me tucked into the waistband of my running tights. It felt heavy. It felt like justice. "Tomorrow is the party," Frank screamed at my back. "The world is going to see you for what you really are." I didn't stop. I walked out into the cold morning air, leaving him alone in his kitchen, standing over the wreckage of a $5 cup and $1 million lie. The kitchen was still. The sun had not quite broken through the gray Washington mist yet, but the room was bright with the harsh, sterile glow of the overhead lights. On the floor, the puddle of black coffee was still spreading, a dark tide lapping at the white cabinets. The shards of the porcelain cup looked like jagged teeth scattered across the tile. A single drop of coffee dripped from the edge of the marble counter, hitting the floor with a rhythmic, hollow sound. Frank did not look at the mess. He did not look at me. He reached into his leather briefcase, the hinges clicking with a sound like a bone snapping in a quiet room. He pulled out a thick folder, the edges slightly frayed from being carried around as a threat. He did not hand it to me. He pushed it across the marble countertop, sliding it through a patch of dry grit until it stopped right in front of my hands. "Sign it," Frank said. His voice was a low, sandpaper rasp. He was trying for concerned father, but he was hitting debt collector instead. He smelled of bourbon and expensive desperation. "Do it for the family, Lily," he continued. His bloodshot eyes tracked the movement of my hands, looking for a tremor that was not there. "I will handle the press. I will tell them you are exhausted. A little combat fatigue, a long overdue sabbatical. They will eat it up. They love a broken hero story. You go away for a while, and this all disappears. The articles, the rumors, all of it." I looked down. The top page was crisp, high-grade bond paper. It had the weight of a funeral shroud. The title was centered in bold black ink, the letters sharp and clinical. Inheritance Renunciation. My mother's house, the little colonial in Alexandria, with the creaky porch and the smell of lavender in the halls. It was the only place in the world where the war did not follow me. It was her legacy, her peace. And Frank was asking me to throw the keys into the dirt so he could clear a debt. "Emily is getting married," Frank said. He leaned back, his silk robe whispering against the stool. "She needs the capital to get a foothold in Washington. Real estate is not cheap, and her fiancé has a reputation to maintain. You are wandering around barracks and naval bases. You are half a world away most of the time. What are you going to do with a 3-bedroom house? Let it rot while you're on a carrier?" He spoke like it was a chore he was doing for me, a favor. He was stripping my skin and telling me I would feel cooler without it. There was no fatherhood in his eyes, just a ledger, just numbers. I looked at him, really looked at him. I did not see a father. I did not even see a man. I saw a lobbyist who had run out of other people's money to spend. He thought I was broke. He thought the Navy paid in buttons and patriotism. He had no idea about the hazard pay. He did not know about the Black Ops stipends I had funneled into diversified portfolios while I was sitting in the mud in Kandahar. He did not know I could buy his entire firm and fire him by lunch. "Emily needs it," I repeated. My voice was a flat, gray stone. "Exactly," Frank said. He mistook my repetition for hesitation. He thought he had found the crack in the armor. "It is the right thing to do, Lily. For your sister. For the Pina name. Think of the optics." He pulled a gold-plated fountain pen from his pocket. The cap clicked off with a cold metallic sound. He pushed it toward me. The nib was gold, pointed, and sharp, like a needle. "Take the deal," he whispered. "Sign the paper, and I will make that article go away. I will give you a graceful exit. Do not be difficult." I reached out. My fingers were steady. No tremor, no hesitation. I picked up the pen. I felt the weight of it. It was balanced, expensive, and completely hollow, just like the man sitting across from me. Frank's mouth twitched. A smirk. A tiny, ugly spark of victory in his eyes. He thought he had won. He thought he had finally found the price for my soul. I did not open the nib. I did not put ink to paper. I turned the pen around. I used the flat, cold base of the cap. I pressed it against the edge of the folder and gave it a slow, deliberate shove. The folder slid across the marble. It moved past the shards of glass. It moved past the spilled coffee. It did not stop until the edge of the paper was hanging off Frank's side of the counter. "I will have my lawyer contact your lawyer," I said. The silence that followed was absolute. I could hear the hum of the refrigerator. I could hear the distant sound of a siren on the street. Frank's face did not just turn red. It turned a dark, bruised shade of purple. He slammed his palms down on the marble. The crack was louder than the porcelain breaking. You think you are in control here? Frank roared. He stood up, his chair screeching against the floor like a dying animal. You have nothing. No family, no reputation, no money. You are a ghost, Lily. I made you, and I can erase you with one phone call. I stood up, slowly. I did not rush. I did not scramble. I smoothed the front of my wool coat. I fastened the top button. My shoulders were square. My spine was steel. I stood a full head taller than him because I was not carrying the weight of 1,000 lies. I looked him dead in the eye. I did not blink. I did not flinch. No, I said. My voice was a blade, sharp, cold, final. I know I am in control. Frank stared at me. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. He looked like he was suffocating on his own bile. I did not wait for him to find his breath. I turned on my heel. I walked out of the kitchen, through the foyer, and out the front door of the Washington house. The air outside was freezing. It was damp and smelled of exhaust and old leaves. I loved it. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. I did not call a lawyer. I called Daniel. Carter, I said when he picked up. Go to the secondary location. Initialize the kill chain on the data stream. I looked back at the house. One light was on in the kitchen. We are done playing defense, I said. I hung up and stepped into the shadows. The hunt was over. The execution was beginning. The diner smelled of 30-year-old grease and industrial-grade floor cleaner. It was a hole in the wall in Arlington, tucked away behind an auto body shop, far enough from the polished marble of Georgetown that the lobbyists wouldn't be caught dead within 10 miles of it. I liked it here. The vinyl of the booth was cracked, exposing the yellow foam like an old wound, and the coffee tasted like a cigarette butt, but it was honest. There was no pretense in a place where the special was a $5 burger and the waitress didn't give a damn about your title. In this dim, yellow light, I wasn't an admiral or a stain on a legacy. I was just another ghost in a city built on top of them. Daniel sat across from me, his massive frame making the booth feel small. He didn't look like the man in the formal whites from the night before. He wore a plain gray hoodie, his hood down, his eyes scanning the door every time the rusty bell chimed. He looked like a man preparing a kill box. He flipped his laptop toward me. On the screen, a video file was queued up. A string of encrypted data ran across the bottom. Military ID authentication tags that glowed a faint, neon blue against the dark background. It's all here, Admiral, Daniel said. His voice was a low rumble, barely audible over the clatter of the kitchen and the hiss of the flat-top grill. The financial trail, the forged signatures on your mother's estate papers, and the footage from the secure line where he admits to skimming the pension to cover his own campaign debts. If anyone tries to delete this from the server, the Pentagon's cybersecurity division will get a red flag before the mouse button even clicks back up. It's hardwired into the cloud now. He looked at me, his eyes hard as flint, reflecting the digital glow of the screen. We have enough to pull him off that stage with the military police right now. Just say the word. I can have a squad at the Ritz in 20 minutes. We can end this before he even opens his mouth. I took a bite of my burger. The meat was overcooked and the bread was dry, but it was solid. It was the kind of food that stayed with you. I chewed slowly, deliberately. I watched a fly buzz against the window, desperate to get out into the cold December air. No, I said. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't have to. Never stop an enemy while he's in the middle of hanging himself. Frank loves an audience. He wants a stage. I'm going to give him the biggest one of his life. I want every donor, every senator, and every camera in D.C. to watch the precise moment his world turns to ash. Daniel nodded, his face unreadable. He didn't ask questions about the ethics or the fallout. He just shut the laptop. The lid closed with a sharp, final snap that echoed off the grease-stained walls. While the smell of cheap burgers faded, it was replaced by the cloying, suffocating scent of 5,000 white roses. The air at the Ritz-Carlton was thick, humid with $300 an ounce perfume and the heat of 1,000 egos. Everything was gold leaf and lead crystal, a glittering mass designed to blind the world to the rot underneath. Frank stood in front of a floor-to-ceiling mirror in the VIP suite, his hands trembling as he adjusted a silk bow tie. He looked like a peacock in a tuxedo. His face was flushed, the broken capillaries in his cheeks, glowing with the success of a man who thought he had successfully buried his last sin. Emily stood behind him, nursing a glass of sparkling water like it was a lifeline. She was biting her lip, her eyes darting toward the door every time a waiter passed by. She looked like a trapped bird in a very expensive cage. "She won't show, will she?" Emily whispered. Her voice was thin, brittle as dry parchment. "I sent the text. I told her to stay away. I told her it was for her own good." Frank checked his reflection one last time, smoothing his thinning hair with a palm that was likely slick with sweat. He gave a sharp, ugly laugh that sounded like dry leaves skittering on pavement. "Lily? I've got her in a vice, Emily. She's got no money, no reputation. And the press already thinks she's a head case. She's probably halfway to a VA hospital by now, looking for a handout. Tonight isn't about her. It's about the legacy. It's about the Pina name being cemented in this town. And that name is ours now, all of it." The buzz of my phone in the dark service corridor felt like a low-voltage shock. I was standing in the shadows of the Ritz, far from the champagne. I pulled the phone out. A text from Emily. "Don't come tonight. Dad is furious. Stay away for your own good. Don't ruin this for us." I stared at the screen for a second. I didn't feel a sting. I didn't feel a throb of betrayal. I just felt a deep, quiet resolve that settled in my gut like lead. I swiped the message into the trash. The deletion was total. I had stopped being a daughter a long time ago. Tonight, I was just the consequence of his actions. I was the bill that finally came due. I'm standing here in the dark, watching the man who erased me prepare to take a bow. And I have to ask, have you ever been told to stay in the shadows for someone else's good? If you've ever had a family member try to cancel your existence to protect their own lie, do me a huge favor. Hit the like button and subscribe to this channel. We're standing on the edge of the truth now, and I need you with me. Leave a comment below. Just right. I see you. Let's show the world that the truth doesn't stay buried, no matter how much gold they pile on top of it. The lights in the ballroom dimmed. A spotlight cut through the dark, landing squarely on the mahogany podium. Frank stepped up, holding a glass of champagne in one hand. He smiled at the crowd. The practiced plastic smile of a man who had spent 40 years lying for a living. I was in the corner, right next to the soundboard. Daniel was standing behind the tech guy, his hand resting casually on the kid's shoulder. To anyone else, it looked like a friendly chat. To me, it looked like a tactical seizure. Daniel had the USB drive palmed. Frank tapped the microphone. The feedback shrieked for a microsecond. "Ladies and gentlemen," Frank began, his voice booming with fake warmth. I stepped forward, just enough for the edge of the spotlight to hit the toe of my polished boots. I caught Daniel's eye. I gave a single, slow nod. Daniel slid the USB into the port. "But tonight," Frank said, his voice rising with theatrical gravity, "I have to address a difficult truth about my youngest daughter, Lily." The giant screen behind him flickered once. Then it went black. The silver fork pinged against the Waterford crystal, a sharp, cold sound that cut through the low hum of 300 leeches in tuxedos. The ballroom of the Ritz-Carlton was a sea of black ties and silk gowns, smelling of expensive cologne and the kind of desperation that only exists in Washington, D.C. Frank Pina stood at the mahogany podium, the spotlight catching the sweat on his upper lip. He looked like a man who owned the world, but I knew better. I knew the rot underneath. "Ladies and gentlemen," Frank began. His voice was a practiced boom, the fake warmth of a man who had spent 40 years selling lies by the gallon. "Thank you for being here. Tonight is about family. It is about legacy. It is about the foundations we build to protect the American dream." I stood in the far corner of the room, hidden by the shadow of a marble pillar. My frayed wool coat was buttoned to the chin, hiding the fire I was about to light. Next to the soundboard, Daniel Carter didn't move. He looked like a statue carved from granite, his eyes fixed on the stage. Frank took a sip of his champagne, his eyes scanning the front rows where the cameras were perched like vultures. But leadership comes with a heavy price, Frank continued, his voice dropping into a rehearsed, theatrical gravity. There are children who make us proud, like my daughter Emily. And then, there are those who lose their way. Those who wrap themselves in delusions of grandeur to hide from their own failures. They run away, they play soldier, and they expect the family name to cover the tab when the reality of their instability finally catches up to them. A ripple of sympathetic murmurs went through the crowd. A senator in the front row nodded, his face a mask of pity. Frank smiled. It was the smirk of a man who thought he had finally won. He was burying me in front of the entire city to protect his campaign fund. He was turning my service into a psychiatric ward story. From table 1, Daniel Carter stood up. The sound of his chair legs scraping across the hardwood was like a gunshot. The room went dead silent. Daniel didn't look at the crowd. He didn't look at the cameras. He stood rigid, his chest out, and pointed a single, calloused finger toward the back of the room. I apologize, Mr. Pina. Daniel's voice rang out, clear and lethal. But there is a superior officer in this room, and I believe she deserves a proper greeting. Every head in the ballroom turned. 300 pairs of eyes swung toward the shadows. I stepped out. I unbuttoned the wool coat and let it slide off my shoulders, hitting the floor with a soft thud. Underneath, my dress blues were crisp, the fabric holding the sharp military creases I'd set with an iron at 4 in the morning. The gold on my shoulder boards caught the light, and the rows of medals on my chest clicked softly. I wasn't the ghost Frank had described. I was the storm. I walked down the center aisle. My heels hit the floor with a sharp, rhythmic crack. I didn't look left or right. I kept my eyes locked on Frank's face. I watched the blood drain from his cheeks until he was the color of bad news. Daniel Carter snapped his heels together. The sound echoed off the high, gilded ceilings. His hand shot up to his brow in a perfect, rigid salute. "Ma'am," Daniel barked, his voice filled with a respect Frank would never earn. "Admiral." I returned the salute, my hand cutting the air with mechanical precision. Behind Frank, the giant projector screen flickered once. The image of the Pina family logo vanished, replaced by a live feed from a secure line. There was no music, no flashy graphics, just a man sitting at a desk in an office that smelled of old wood and high-stakes decisions. It was General John Maddox, 4 stars, the Pentagon. "Mr. Pina," the general's voice boomed through the ballroom, flat and heavy. "I am interrupting this event to provide a formal verification. Admiral Lily Pina is currently the operational commander for the Task Force 7. Her rank is not a delusion. Her service is a matter of national security." The general paused, his eyes narrowing through the screen at Frank's trembling form. "Any further attempt to undermine the character or the rank of this officer will be viewed as a direct defamation of the United States military. We are monitoring this situation. Good evening." The screen went black. The silence in the Ritz was so thick you could hear the champagne bubbles popping. Frank tried to speak, but his throat had turned to sand. He stepped back, his heel catching on the edge of the riser. He fumbled for the podium, his hand knocking into the crystal champagne tower sitting on the side table. The tower of glasses went down. It felt like it happened in slow motion. The glasses hit the floor, exploding into 1,000 shimmering teeth. 100 gallons of expensive champagne splashed across Frank's shoes, soaking into the silk of his trousers. He looked like a drowned rat in a tuxedo. The senators who had been nodding along a minute ago were now looking at their watches, turning their backs, and melting into the crowd. The network of power Frank had built was dissolving like sugar in the rain. I didn't smile. I didn't say a word. I just stood there for a heartbeat, watching him realize that the lie was dead and he was standing in the wreckage. I turned on my heel. I didn't look back at the shattered glass or the man who had tried to erase me. I walked with long, deliberate steps toward the exit, the weight of the medals on my chest feeling lighter than they ever had. The execution was over. Now, it was time for the cleanup. The silence in my Alexandria apartment was a different kind of quiet. It wasn't the heavy, suffocating weight of Georgetown. It was clean. It tasted like cold air and black coffee that had sat too long in the pot. I sat at the small kitchen table, staring at the dust motes dancing in the gray morning light. My dress blues were hung up. I was back in a plain white t-shirt and gray sweatpants. I looked like a civilian, but my pulse was still running at a steady, tactical beat. Pounding. The door didn't just rattle, it groaned. Someone was using a fist like a sledgehammer. I didn't rush. I took a sip of the room temperature coffee, the bitterness coating my tongue like a layer of grit. I stood up, walked to the door, and checked the peephole. Frank. He looked like a man who had been dragged behind a freight train for 10 miles. His $5,000 suit was wrinkled, the silk tie hanging limp like a dead snake around his neck. His eyes were bloodshot, rimmed with the kind of red you only see in a desperate gambler who just lost the house and the shirt on his back. The arrogance of the Ritz-Carlton had been scrubbed off his face by a night of phone calls that went straight to voicemail. I opened the door 6 inches. I didn't take the chain off. I didn't need to. I stood there, one hand on the frame, my body blocking the entrance. I was a wall of muscle and memory. "You destroyed it," Frank rasped. He tried to push his way in, but I didn't budge. He might as well have been trying to move a mountain. "The firm is hemorrhaging. 3 major defense contracts pulled out by midnight. The lobbyists, they won't even pick up my calls. You have to call Maddox. Tell him it was a mistake. Tell him you lied." He was panting. He smelled like a distillery and old sweat. The elite lobbyist of the Ritz-Carlton had vanished. In his place was a small, scared man whose bank account was suddenly on fire. "It wasn't a mistake, Frank," I said. My voice was a dead calm. "It was a correction. You built a career on a foundation of sand and my mother's blood. The tide just came in. I am just the one who made sure the sea walls didn't hold." "I'm your father," he roared. He slammed his hand against the door. "I raised you. I gave you that name. You owe me, Lily. You can't just let me rot." "And the house. The Alexandria place. It's the only asset I have left that hasn't been frozen. I need it. I am moving back in. I won't have you throwing me into the street." He was using the word father like a shield. He had spent decades using it as a weapon, and now that the bullets were flying his way, he wanted to hide behind the title he had never earned. I stepped back, unhooked the chain, and reached for a manila envelope on the counter. I didn't invite him in. I just stood in the gap. "My lawyer spent the night digging through the archives, Frank," I said. I pulled out a single sheet of paper. "Turns out you weren't the only one who knew how to move money. My mother, she knew what you were. She saw the greed in you before I was even born." I held the paper up. It was a deed transfer, dated 5 years ago. "She didn't leave the house to you, Frank. She left it to a trust. A trust that I have controlled since I turned 33. You have been living in my house for 5 years, and you didn't even know it. You were too busy skimming my pension to check the property taxes." Frank's jaw dropped. He looked like he had been slapped. His mouth worked, but no sound came out. The man who prided himself on being the smartest guy in D.C. had been a tenant in his own home. "You think you can kick me out?" he whispered. The aggression was gone, replaced by a whining, pathetic tone. "After everything?" "No," I said. I pulled a second paper from the envelope, a lease agreement. "I am a fair landlord. You can stay, but you are going to pay. Market rate. Alexandria isn't cheap these days, Frank. $2,500 a month, plus utilities, every month." I handed him a pen. Not his gold-plated one. A cheap plastic ballpoint that felt like a piece of junk in his hand. "Sign it," I said. "Or I call the sheriff and have your silk suits tossed onto the sidewalk by noon. Your choice. Sign the paper or find a park bench." Frank looked at the paper. He looked at the pen. He was shaking. The humiliation was thick enough to choke on. He looked at me, looking for a shred of the daughter who used to want his approval. He found nothing but a blank, gray stare. He leaned against the doorframe and scribbled his name. It was a jagged, broken signature. He handed the paper back, his eyes wet with a fake, manipulative grease. "I hope you are happy," he spat. Taking your own father's money. You are just as cold as they say. I looked at the signature. It was legal. It was binding. I don't want your money, Frank, I said. He paused, his hand halfway to his pocket. What? Every cent of this rent, I said, my voice turning into a serrated edge. Every single dollar you pay me to keep a roof over your head is being automatically debited. It is going straight to the Gold Star Families Fund. The families of the men and women who actually died for something, unlike you. Frank flinched like I had hit him with a club. You are going to pay for the education of soldiers' kids, Frank. You are going to buy groceries for widows. For the rest of your life, your greed is going to fund the honor you tried to steal from me. Frank looked at me, truly seeing me for the first time. He didn't see a daughter. He didn't see a victim. He saw the Admiral. He saw the person who had finally, completely, destroyed him. He turned around without a word. He walked down the hall, his shoulders slumped, his loafers scuffing the carpet. He looked like a ghost. I did not watch him go. I stepped back into my apartment. I grabbed the heavy brass bolt and slid it home. Clack. The sound was final. It was the sound of a door closing on a life that did not belong to me anymore. I walked back to the kitchen, picked up my cold coffee, and poured it into the sink. The war was over. The cleanup had begun. But as I looked at my reflection in the window, I did not see a winner. I saw a woman who was finally, for the first time in 38 years, completely alone. And it was the best I had ever felt. The sun was a weak, pale yellow, bleeding through the blinds of my Alexandria apartment. It didn't warm anything. It just highlighted the dust. I sat on the gray sofa, my back straight, my heels planted firm on the hardwood. I wasn't waiting for a call. I wasn't waiting for an apology. I was just sitting in the wreckage of a life I'd finally stopped trying to fix. The silence in the room was absolute, a heavy airless vacuum that made my ears ring. Then, the noise started. The phone on the glass coffee table didn't just ring. It screamed. It buzzed against the surface, a frantic rhythmic vibration that sounded like a trapped insect dying against a window pane. Buzz, buzz, buzz. I didn't pick it up. I watched the screen flicker in the dim light. 15 messages, all from Emily. I didn't need to read them to know the script, but I did anyway. I reached out, my thumb felt like a lead weight as I swiped the glass. Lily, pick up. Dad is losing his mind. He's drinking again, the real bad stuff. You ruined everything. The firm is gone. My wedding is in 3 weeks, Lily. The caterers are threatening to pull out because the check bounced. How could you do this? Do you even care about your own blood? I stared at the words. Not once did she ask if I was okay. Not once did she mention the years I spent in the dirt while she spent Frank's money on shoes and brunch. She was drowning, and she was pissed off that I wouldn't let her use my head as a stepping stone. To Emily, I wasn't a sister. I was a safety net that had finally snapped. I tapped her name. My finger didn't tremble. I hit the button that said, block contact. The phone went dark. The silence that followed was different. It was final. It was the sound of a bridge finally collapsing into the water. I've heard that sound before. Kabul, 2018. I was lying in a military ICU that smelled like bleach and copper. I had tubes in my ribs and a hole in my memory where the last 48 hours used to be. I was alone then too, but that was a clean kind of lonely. The enemy was outside the wire. They had beards and rifles. You knew where they stood. You knew they wanted you dead. This was worse. The enemy had slept in the room next to mine. They had eaten at my mother's table. They had smiled at me while they planned to pick my pockets. I stood up. My knees popped in the quiet, a dry, hollow sound. I walked over to the bookshelf in the corner. It was mostly manuals, tactical guides, navigation charts, things with clear rules and predictable outcomes. But there was one thing that didn't belong. A wooden frame, 10 years old. It was a photo from Emily's college graduation. Frank was in the center, his chest puffed out like a rooster, one arm draped over Emily's shoulder. They were both glowing, bathed in the artificial light of a steakhouse that cost more than my monthly car payment. I was on the far right, half turned. My face was a blur, like I was already trying to escape the frame before the shutter even clicked. I looked at Frank's face in the photo. The man in that picture didn't exist. Maybe he never did. He was just a mask made of vanity and cheap whiskey. I had spent 30 years trying to earn a smile from a ghost. I wasn't a daughter to him. I was an insurance policy, a piece of social capital he could trade for a seat at a bigger table. I felt a cold, sharp twitch in my gut. It wasn't grief. It was an ending. I gripped the edges of the frame. The wood was cheap pine, stained to look like something expensive. A lie, just like the people inside it. I twisted my hands. Crack! The wood splintered, a sharp, dry snap that felt good in the palms of my hands. The glass didn't just break, it shivered. Shards hit the floor, sounding like tiny diamonds falling on the hardwood. I pulled the photo out. I didn't look at it again. I didn't need to. I walked to the kitchen and stepped on the pedal of the trash can. The lid flipped up with a hollow plastic thud. I dropped the photo inside, right on top of an empty coffee bag and a pile of junk mail. It was over. I went to the utility closet and grabbed the broom. The bristles were stiff and old. I began to sweep. I moved from the corners toward the center. Scritch, scritch, scritch. I gathered the wood splinters. I gathered the glass. I gathered the dust of a decade of lies. I watched the pile grow in the middle of the floor. It was small, all those years of pain, and it all fit into a tiny, pathetic heap of garbage. I swept it into the dustpan and dumped it. Every last bit. I walked back to the sofa and sat down. I looked at the spot on the shelf where the frame had been. It was empty. The whole room was empty. The whole house was empty. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my cigarettes. I hadn't smoked in 3 years. I kept a pack in the back of the drawer for emergencies. This felt like one. I lit it, the smoke thick and gray in the dim afternoon light. I exhaled, watching the cloud drift toward the ceiling, spinning in the stale air. I was alone. No father, no sister, no family. Just me and the quiet of a clean apartment. I leaned my head back and closed my eyes. For the first time in my life, I didn't have a mission. I didn't have a target. I didn't have anyone to protect who wasn't worth the effort. I was just Lily. And for now, that was plenty. The sun hit the floorboards, a little higher now. The day was moving on. I stood up and grabbed my car keys. I didn't know where I was going. But for the first time, I didn't need a map to find my way out. The clock hit 0600. I didn't need the alarm to tell me it was time. My body was a machine built on a schedule, a rhythm of brass and bone that didn't know how to sleep in. I stood in front of the small mirror in my Alexandria bathroom. No steam, no luxury, just the cold, white light of a morning that didn't owe anyone an apology. I pulled on the shirt. The fabric was stiff, the starch holding it together like a layer of armor. Then, the jacket. I didn't reach for the wool coat this time. I didn't need to hide. I let the gold shoulder boards shine. I checked my phone. One new email. Transaction successful. The subject line was clinical, cold, perfect. Frank had paid. I could almost see him doing it, his hand shaking as he typed in his routing number, his face a bruised purple as he realized he was finally a tenant in his own life. The check cleared for the full market rate, $3,000 of sweat equity he'd squeezed out of some lobbyist, now sitting in my account for exactly 6 seconds before the second notification hit. Gold Star Families Support Fund, thank you for your monthly contribution. I let out a breath. It was a clean release. Every cent Frank paid to keep his ego under a roof was now buying groceries for a kid whose father didn't come home from the surge. It was buying books for a girl whose mother died in a dry creek bed in Herat. Frank's greed was finally doing some good in the world, and he didn't even have the balls to stop it. I looked at my reflection. The scar on my left ribs didn't itch anymore. The ache in my jaw was gone. I was 38, and for the first time, I didn't feel like a debt that needed to be paid. The phone buzzed. A call. "Pina," I said. "Admiral." Daniel's voice came through. It was steady, professional, the sound of a man who stood on solid ground. "The team is assembled at the base. We've got the 0800 briefing on the new deployment. Everyone is accounted for. We're just waiting on the lead. I'm 5 minutes from my rig, Daniel, I said. See you on the line. I hung up. I grabbed my keys. The heavy brass ring that didn't chime with fear anymore. I walked out of the apartment, my heels hitting the stairs with a sharp, rhythmic clack. The hallway smelled like old wood and floor wax. Outside, the air was a cold slap to the face. It was crisp. It was clean. It didn't have the moldy, suffocating scent of the Georgetown townhouse or the fake rose petals of the Ritz. It just smelled like winter and the Potomac. I walked to the curb where my Ford F-150 was parked. It wasn't a DC car. It wasn't a silk-lined Mercedes or a black SUV with tinted windows meant to hide a politician's shame. It was a truck. It was gray, covered in a thin layer of road salt, with a dent in the rear bumper from a loading dock in Norfolk. It was honest. I tossed my bag onto the passenger seat. I climbed in, the leather of the seat cold against my legs. I didn't look back at the apartment. I didn't look back at the road toward DC. I looked at the dashboard. A small photo was tucked into the corner of the speedometer. A group shot from the deck of the USS Nimitz. Daniel was there. Miller was there. A dozen men and women in flight suits, grinning like idiots against a backdrop of endless blue. That was the family. They weren't tied to me by a name on a birth certificate. They were tied to me by the grease on our hands and the blood we'd washed off the deck. They didn't want my pension. They didn't want my silence. They just wanted me to lead. I shoved the key into the ignition and turned it. The engine didn't just start. It roared. A deep, guttural growl that vibrated through the steel frame and up into my spine. It was the sound of 1,000 horses ready to run. I shifted into gear and pulled away from the curb. I hit the highway within 3 minutes. The road was wide, the tarmac a dark ribbon stretching out toward the horizon. To the east, the sun was just beginning to break, a jagged line of fire cutting through the gray clouds. It hit the windshield, blinding and brilliant, washing the cabin in a fierce golden light. I looked in the rearview mirror. Behind me, the DC skyline was a tiny, jagged shadow. The monuments, the townhouses, the ballrooms, they were all shrinking into a single, gray dot. Frank Pina was back there, probably staring at a wall, wondering how he'd lost everything to a ghost. Emily was back there, crying over a wedding that was built on a lie. I didn't feel sorry for them. I didn't feel anything at all. I checked the phone on the console. The screen was black. No messages, no missed calls, no buzzing. The silence was the loudest thing I'd ever heard, and it was beautiful. It was the sound of a slate being wiped clean. I pressed my foot down on the gas. The truck surged forward, the engine humming a steady, powerful tune. I rolled down the window, letting the freezing wind whip through the cabin, stinging my cheeks and blowing the last of the Georgetown ghosts out the door. I wasn't a daughter anymore. I wasn't a victim. I wasn't an insurance policy. I was the Admiral. And the road ahead was wide open. I didn't need a map. I just needed the sun. I drove straight into the light,